We now begin the 20th lecture in the series of memorial lectures. This lecture is in memory of Bertolt Brecht, a German theatre practitioner, playwright, and poet. This lecture is titled Heinrich Heine and Karl Marx as Essayists, on the genesis and the function of the critic intellectuals, and will be delivered by Professor Miguel Vedda. This lecture will be chaired by Professor Peter Beilharz. Can I request our speaker and our chair to please come on stage? Peter Beilharz is a professor of culture and society at Curtin University. In 1980, he co-founded the International Journal of Social Theory, Thesis 11, and has edited it for nearly 40 years. He has written and edited 27 books. He is a fellow in cultural sociology at Yale and visiting professor at the University of Leeds. He is presently editing books on essays of Gramsci and on Marx. Can I request Professor Beilharz to take over the proceedings?
I'm very happy to be chairing this session, which I shall endeavour to chair with an iron hand. I'm delighted to be in this session because of the subject matter, which intrigues me. Professor Miguel Vedda is full professor, titular plenario at the Chair of German Literature and Director of the Department of Literature at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. He's the Principal Investigator of Scientific and Technical Research Council, a member of the Marxist collective Herramienta. He's President of the Latin American Association of German Studies, co-editor of the Anuario Argentino de Germanista and Ibero-Amerikanische Jahrbuch für Germanistik. He is member of the International Georg Lukács Gesellschaft. His principal interests are in modern German literature, Marxist literary theory and aesthetics. Recent publications include a book on Siegfried Kracauer, one on Walter Benjamin, both 2010, a third in 2011 on both Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Kracauer. Further works on Goethe, Reading Goethe 2015. He's the translator and editor of one of the most important books in the world, Goethe's Faust. He's also translated Eichendorff, Heine, Marx, Kafka, Lukács and Kracauer, among many others. Why am I so excited to be in this situation and to be able to learn from what Professor Vedda might have to say? It seems to me, and I don't think this is controversial, that as with other figures such as Hess and Bauer, Heine is one of a culture, one of a very important cultural context, which it's important to locate Marx within. It's important to, in other words, remember that Marx is a result, that he's a result of his culture, and to think and rethink the younger Marx as a laboratory for the Grundrisse and Kapital, but also as a crucial cultural moment in its own right. Professor Vedda.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the invitation to take part in this wonderful conference. I am going to speak about Heinrich Heine and Karl Marx and on a book, the book from Heinrich Heine on Ludwig Burnet, one of the leading essay writers of the 19th century in Germany. This is the Spanish edition with my translation and introduction. So I would like to start by making reference to the words with which the great Latin American Marxist José Carlos Mariátegui defines his particular thought and writing style. I quote, "None of these essays is finished. They never will be as long as I live and think and have something to add to what I have written, lived, and thought. I am not an impartial, objective critic. I am far removed from the academic techniques of the university." Mariátegui commends the heuristic and aesthetic value of what is provisional against that systematic philosophy which attempts to conceal every trace of the bond with the living experience under the pretense of conclusion and closure. Georges Sorel, one of Mariátegui's most celebrated models, shows a similar disposition in his methodological considerations in the letter to Daniela Levy, which precedes the Reflections on Violence. The French thinker writes back to those who have objected to his not abiding by writing style conventions and making readers uncomfortable due to the antidiness of his expositions. Sorel smugly introduces himself not as a professor or as a science popularizer, but as an autodidact who publicly exhibits the notebooks that have fueled his own learning. He is not as interested in gaining knowledge as he is in deleting the ideas imposed on him. Hence his method. I quote, "I put before my readers the product of a mental effort which is endeavoring to break through the constraints of what has previously been constructed for common use and which seeks to discover what is personal. I readily skip the points of transition because they nearly always fall into the category of commonplaces. What the foregoing authors highlight is the exploratory dimension of Marxism, that which has been its method since the hour of its birth and for each of its leading representatives. What is involved here is to promote, in revolutionary thinking, an openness and a ductility which are not the product of intellectual laziness. Instead, they result from the proximity to experience, from the attention to each of its realities and latencies, and, at the same time, from the rejection of dogmas and received ideas. This position evinces the elective affinity between dialectical materialism and the tradition of essayists, not only as a genre, but also, and more importantly, as a method of inquiry, and even as an ethical and political stance towards the world. The etymology of the word used by Montaigne to refer to the tradition that he himself starts points at the direction we are discussing. Derived from the Latin exagium, the term suggests to what extent this writing is characterized by experimentation in a double sense. On the one hand, it aims to be a test, an experiment, an exploration. On the other hand, its proximity to the concrete experience distinguished it from the dogmatic abstraction of the treatise. The essayist, from the beginnings of the genre, is someone who only considers true those judgments which he has formed out of his own experience, or at any rate, those which match such experience. This skepticism to received ideas accounts for the development of a writing which is not a subsequent addition to a finished result. Rather, it is an accompanying process of capturing his own process of change. The interest in the path, rather than the goal, is the expression of a thought that escapes what is definitive and that appears to manifest itself in the same moment in which it is wrought, as we have commented in relation to Mariátegui. The topic is relevant for us today because it helps, above all, to define the possibilities and the limits of Marxism in Latin America. The revolutionary thought in South America was not directed mainly towards the composition of systematic and comprehensive works due to its material conditions and the dominant traditions of thought, as well as the institutional precariousness and the unstable conditions in which Latin American intellectuals had to live. It managed, though, to turn necessity into virtue, which explains the broad and fruitful production of essays by Latin American Marxism. A second reason for the relevance of essay writing in Latin America is related to a central problem of our time, the problem of the genesis, the history, the functions, and the vanishing of the figure of the critical intellectual. In the third place, we believe that the previously mentioned affinity between essayism and Marxism is a fundamental feature in Marx's work and the tradition of thought and praxis he has started. Forsaking this essayist perspective has had devastating effects on historical materialism. Let's start by the second point. A question that has remained unexplored is to what extent the genesis of the modern intellectual developed in the Paris of the Restoration period. One of the first outlines of that model emerges in the context of the dispute between Ludwig Burnet and Heinrich Heine, about which Enzensberger wrote, "It is possibly the controversy with the greatest consequences for German literature. The debate lasts 150 years and no ending in sight." The essay, Ludwig Burnet, a memorial, 1840, is one of the first and more challenging attempts to define the peculiarities and the function of the modern intellectual. This figure is defined in contrast with the model embodied by Burnet. The book about Burnet was thought of as a livre maudit when it appeared. Heine's hostility toward the essayist from Frankfurt earned him much criticism from those who only perceived the argumentum ad hominem but failed to reach the core of the book, which partly focused on the confrontation between two intellectual models. In the German-speaking intellectual stage, there was a noteworthy exception, Marx. At the beginning of April 1846, Marx wrote to Heine about the Burnet Debate in the following terms, I quote, "A few days ago, a short lampoon against you happened to fall into my hands. Posthumous letters of Buenos. I should never have held him to be so dull, petty, and inept as it is possible to read here in black and white. I shall be writing a detailed review of your book on Burnet for a German periodical. A more clumsy treatment than that suffered by this book at the hands of these Christian Teutonic jackasses would be hard to find in any period of literature, and yet there's no lack of clumsiness in any period of Germany." The revision of the Heine-Burnet controversy is one of Marx's unfulfilled projects. Part of what we will hereby say aims at clarifying where the affinity between the revolutionary philosopher and the radical poet may lie. A first aspect worth mentioning may be Heine's inflamed essayism. In the context of the debates with the untimely Jacobin Burnet, Heine expressed his conviction that the only reasonable option for the modern intellectual could not mean embracing a doctrinaire Weltanschauung, which had already resolved all theoretical problems and should, therefore, be simply spread and applied by his advocates. Instead, it should be an exploratory practice for which there are no paths nor goals. Located between the fronts, the intellectual cannot find shelter in the aestheticist withdrawal nor in the comfort of a political doctrine, rather in a search deprived of certainties, which represents the only and genuine commitment to the wretched of the earth. The typical tiering of modernity demands that the intellectuals should forsake their dogmatic certainties and assume the uncertainties typical of the torn consciousness. Such an attitude allowed Heine to become the originary form of a central figure of modernity, that of the critical intellectual. It is known that for Sartre, the birth date of the modern intellectual is the last third of the 19th century, in the context of the agitation around the Dreyfus affair. However, Gerhard Heine well pointed out that before the intellectuals manifest themselves, there were already individual intellectuals, and that the Paris of the Restoration age had already offered the ground for their emergence. The fact that, according to Sartre, the tiering, the chirure, is a defining feature of the intellectual endorses Heine's proposal, especially if it is considered to what extent Heine felt torn apart between the task of writing and the necessity to surpass the limits of his own métier, to commit to the reality of his time. It is telling that not only was Heine the target of the conservative offensive due to his political radicalism, but he also was questioned by the revolutionaries who found his respect for artistic perfection unacceptable. But Heine was also pestered for not making his criticism serve one political party and for preserving his autonomy in terms of an independent intellectual. Heine anticipated one of the dilemmas that the critical intellectual faced throughout the 20th century, the difficulty and the necessity to keep the independent individual's lucid stance and to affirm, nonetheless, a commitment to social reality. Heine thus embodies the attempt to represent the role of the intellectual who risks taking his explorations forward by delineating his own paths. It is not by chance that the German poet questioned the paralyzing effect of the orthodoxies. Less enthusiastic than his Republican or conservative contemporaries, he feels attracted by skepticism. Better still, he feels dragged by a pendular movement between certainty and doubt, action and thought, pathos and satire. Each of these extremes, dialectically, contributes to relativize the abuses that the other may carry with it. The problematic appears in the Burnet book as an alternation between the revolutionary ebb and flow, or between the zeal of empathy and the cold critical distance. Unable to examine the essential dialectics of the movement of history, Burnet is carried away in one direction or the other by the movements produced on the surface of the agitated social life. Heine introduces his rival as a subject imprisoned in the present, incapable of looking beyond the closest visual field, in keeping with Burnet's own identification with the model of the writer for reviews. The description of the character suggests at the beginning some shallowness and a rush that will become his constituent elements. Burnet comes into the room where Heine is reading and begins to walk to and fro, looking for precisely a newspaper. Burnet's unexpected jumping from a morose mood into a gay one provides further evidence for the fact that the essayist is a subject who swings between opposite positions, carried by zigzagging times. Burnet, however, ignores it and believes that he remains invariable and that it is the others who swing. The strategy which advances Burnet's behavior as childish aims at highlighting the infantile feature of voluntarism. According to Heine, this is an aesthetic or political Sturm und Drang, which should be followed by a mature reflection, guided not so much by subjective enthusiasm, rather than by a definition of one's own perspectives of action based on a survey of the social and historical reality. This mode of reflection makes it possible to relativize both activist optimism and depression into despondency and melancholy, which tend to afflict the utopian when history does not satisfy his whims. Subjectivism hinders Burnet sober inquiry into historical reality and imposes limits on him at the level The malleability may be a key to understand Burnet's behavior after the July Revolution, his inflammation at the minor variations of the political climate and his tendency to allow agitators to invoke him and manipulate him like an effigy or a puppet in order to carry out their projects. It is as if Burnet's extremely impressionable character, which has allowed him to grasp the smallest variations of his contemporary reality, has also condemned him to a permanent swing and, eventually, to a shipwreck. The restriction to social, political, current circumstances is connected with an activism that made Burnet more and more vulnerable to the optimism of the will. The experimental essayism of his early work started to give way to an instrumental concept of literature. For him, the aesthetic dimension remains at the background of the rhetorical will to transmit contents and convince the reader, a concept in which doctrinaire features increasingly prevail. The literary asceticism is coupled with that Nazarene austerity which relates Burnet to both Jacobinism in Robespierre's fashion and the Christian mysticism of Lamennais. It is faith in the validity of Jacobin moralism that leads Burnet to exert violence on history by trying to impose a possibility which is not present in it. Unlike Burnet, Heine believes that the possibilities of political intervention can only be found within the historical process. In order to discover them, it is necessary to look into the tendencies of the present that point to the future. These conditions cannot be artificially created. Trying to impose a historical change without paying attention to reality will only lead to catastrophe. Heine directs some criticism to those revolutionaries who can only administer radical treatments whose effect is a steeper decline, and in general, to those who want to produce a revolution without paying attention to historical conditions. At the end of chapter 4, there appears a remarkable allegory of the revolution coded in the image of golden chains which strongly hold the Messiah down, since without these fetters, the Messiah, when he sometimes loses patience, would otherwise suddenly hurry down and undertake the work of salvation too soon in the wrong hour. The idea is to prevent a rush which could exert violence upon history from thwarting the messianic liberation from all forms of oppression. Hence, the appeal for human emancipation not be thwarted due to voluntarist zeal. I quote, "O despair not, handsome Messiah, who wants not only to save Israel, as the superstitious Jews think, but all of suffering mankind. Oh, do not break your golden chains. Oh, keep him bound for a time, so that he does not come too soon, the saving King of the world." The doctrinaires tend to believe, and this is what happened to Burnet in his late years, that if historical and material facts do not match their own obsessions, so much worse for the facts. This accounts for Burnet's stubbornness to introduce himself as an internally unitary personality rooted in fixed convictions, which can be coded into fixed dogmas and spread as such. So far, we have barely talked about Marx. Nevertheless, the foregoing comments hint at him, since he's one of the most outstanding figures in that first generation of critical intellectuals who made use of the essay as an eminent form. Marx is, in fact, one of the major 19th century German essayists. This does not mean that the German revolutionary was not a great philosopher or a brilliant scientist. We simply highlight, on the one hand, that among Marx's talents there was also his capacity to write essays, intellectually acute, aesthetically distinguished, and stirring. On the other hand, as we have anticipated, essayism is for him a methodology and further a way of relating to the world. It is suggestive that one of the first and major attempts to understand these questions was born in Latin America. We are making reference to the book by the Venezuelan Ludovico Silva, The Literary Style of Marx, 1971. As an essayist, Marx was capable of using a multiplicity of styles and registers. His resolution to break with pre-established forms is foregrounded in all of them. The Communist Manifesto offers a typical example. As it is known, the first version written by Engels, The Principles of Communism, was composed as a catechism articulated upon questions and answers, as it was usual in this time. The Communist Manifesto, whose writing only corresponds to Marx, abides by the demand Engels issued on November 23rd in 1847. I quote, "Give a little thought to the confession of faith. I think we would do best to abandon the catechetical form." The text thus rids itself of a long tradition of scholastic socialism in a sudden and brilliant way. The style, the aesthetic and rhetorical structure of the manifesto, the rich imagery, the effective use of satire and irony are such defining features of this essay as the demands it puts forward to the reading public of its time. Readers do not find a set of conclusive answers, but an invitation to delve like explorers into terra incognita. Marx's continuous desire to learn from reality is an authentic essayistic gesture. The attention is related to Marx's unwavering hatred against everything that is petrified. One of the most prominent expressions of such hatred in the manifesto is the acclaimed passage which celebrates the eruption of the bourgeois era, in spite of its ill-fated aspects, because in that period all freed, fast-frozen relations with the trend of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. Just like Heine, Marx wanted to rescue Germany from the fossilized state of inertia during the Restoration period, but apart from these specific circumstances, his attitude describes the philosopher's fundamental stance. In addition, liberating historical reality from the spell that captivates it is valid, according to Marx, insofar as this liberation does not mean imposing on such reality a course of action which is alien to it. On the contrary, this liberation means paying attention to the latent elements in the core of reality. Young Marx refers to this in the famous statement, "This petrified condition must be made to dance by singing to them their own melody." Marx's basic idea is thus the transformation of the world does not call for the imposition of an external idea, but the liberation of the potentialities that remain locked in the world. The essence of the method can be summarized in Michelangelo's verses, which Lukács took pleasure in paraphrasing. "The greatest sculptor can no thought conceive that doth not now lie deep buried in stone." In very different periods, Marx frequently condemns subjective violence, harshly questioned by Heine, as well in relation to Burnet and his followers, and contested by the allegory of the chained Messiah. It is present in the literary discussions of Marx, in his long comment on the Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue. Marx finds annoying how the author manipulates his materials from above, instead of examining their latencies, as the great artist does when he scrutinizes marble. Once and again, she is carried away by the temptation to reduce the characters to docile automata, subservient to the author's abstract conceptions. His melodramatic novel gains some vitality when its characters manage not to subdue to the author's spiritualistic ethics and his spokesman, the philanthropist Rodolphe. It is evident how close these positions are to Heine's in relation to his controversy with Burnet, as evident as the distance Marx takes from those intellectuals who stick to the surface of social life without examining its laws. Marx was aware of the fact that the downside of the phenomenological closeness to the world of the 19th century essayists' own life was the danger of remaining attached to immediacy, to the hectic surface of appearances. Marx shared with Hegel the conviction that it is necessary to focus on the calm of the essence, die Ruhe des Wesens, i.e., the principles that lie on the base of apparent phenomena and are thus much less visible. The search for what is essential behind the shaken circumstances is a feature that characterizes Marx and distinguishes him from his contemporaries. Perpetual swing between extreme optimism and extreme hopelessness. Let's remember once again his criticism against Burnet. Marx's sober objectivity is in keeping with the feature that has essentially distinguished all the great essayists, the resistance to accept, worship authorities, and received ideas without questioning them. The word critic, which is present in so many titles of Marx's work, defines his stance as regards his preceding traditions. Unlike many of his root mates, Marx never was a young Hegelian. This also accounts for his relationship with Feuerbach or with the political economists. His attitude is different from Engels, who was much prone to a receptive attitude towards other thinkers, and who, when young, blindly worshipped Ludwig Burnet. For Marx, truth did not lie in the words of a thinker, but in the free exploration of a living reality. One could not imagine a starker contrast than that between the founder of Marxism and many of his so-called disciples. We started this article with an allusion to a Latin American thinker. We will finish by referring to another one. In his aforementioned study about Marx's literary style, Ludovico Silva highlights that in the core of the attack to Proudhon, as it is developed in the poverty of philosophy, there lies the conviction that such work is no more than an attempt to subdue history to Hegelian categories. According to Marx, the mistake Proudhon made is, in Silva's words, the same grave mistake that inspectors, philosophers in Marxism make today. They behave as the Praetorian Guard in relation to the three laws of dialectics, and turn Marx into the most frenzied Hegelian idealist. For Marx, dialectics was not a logic method, strictly speaking. It was a historical method. For a method to be formally correct, emptiness is its first condition, but Marx was fully interested in history, its multiple concretion. There might not be perhaps a more appropriate way to describe Marx's essayism. Thank you very much.
With thanks to Professor Vedda and to you, I have to apologize to you and to Professor Vedda. The next speaker is awaiting us on Skype. So I'm unable to apply the Desai rule of short questions. There will, I'm afraid, be no questions at all.
Yeah, we can discuss at dinner, perhaps.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Beilharz, and thank you, Professor Brecht. Can I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the memento on Adri's behalf?